Today on Stronger Than Reason, we branch out to Chris Connelly's solo career with his debut album, Whiplash Boychild. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, let's talk about platforms. And no, I don't mean those games where you jump from one flat place to another. By the way, the arcade Donkey Kong was arguably the first platform game and is still the best classic arcade game in my opinion. And I don't mean platforms as associated with a political party, you know, the collective opinions and stances that the party represents. No, I'm not talking about that. Neither am I talking about the things the Olympic champions stand on when receiving their medals. I mean, platforms in the modern media sense, a position from which one can express themselves to an audience. If you're the kind of person who embraces social media, your account is a platform, probably a relatively small one, but it gives you a way to communicate your views and thoughts to those who follow you. In general, a platform of this sort must be earned. It isn't granted as a right. In other words, people have to find enough value in the things you have to say to want to continue listening. And your words or actions or whatever you're expressing will grow your audience if they're compelling enough. You'll find yourself with a bigger platform over time. Something like that is happening with this show on a very small scale because a year ago, it had just a fraction of the current subscribers and correspondingly fewer views. Now, I could go down a rabbit hole here into my own theories of media production and consumption, but I don't want to accidentally wind up with a PhD. So suffice to say that a platform is really only useful if you have something to say. Now, Andy Warhol said in the future, everyone would be famous for 15 minutes, and that's never been as true as it is today, when even the most obscure internet rando might find themselves making a post that goes unexpectedly viral. Now, it's a thrill when that happens, as I'm sure you can attest, because it's likely already happened to you. And it gives you a goose, doesn't it? It gives you a dopamine hit, and for a minute you think, wow, I want this to keep going. But unfortunately, attention spans have never been shorter, and chances are your newfound audience will disperse for parts unknown long before you ever get around to carefully penning a pithy follow-up. Even growing this show has not been straightforward because subscribers come and go all the time, despite the fact that the total number is slowly, very slowly inching upward. Hell, for all I know, I might be speaking to completely different folks than I was speaking to a year ago. It's hard to say for sure with the analytics that I have access to, but there's definitely been quite a bit of turnover because there's a ton of competition out there for ears and eyes and for hearts and minds. So building a platform for yourself, growing an audience, unless you're very lucky, is a slow burn. And as you go along, you're always testing the limits, right? Maybe posting content people might not like as much, stretching the bounds of your brand, giving yourself a little more freedom. So consider this show. If I want a video that's going to be sure to get a lot of views, I just have to talk about Skinny Puppy, Ministry, or Nine Inch Nails, because that's what my core audience wants. But I've been introducing other sorts of topics in the past year, movies, books, games, not just industrial rock, and who knows if you'll all go along with it, but I'm going to continue the show, and if it's going to continue, I have no choice but to try other things, because there's little point in rehashing the same material over and over. And if you, as the creator, are bored with your creation, it's time to knock it in the head, right? There's no point doing it unless you're into it. As Shakespeare said in Hamlet, to thine own self be true. So a creator or artist sometimes just has to do their own thing, something unexpected. And this can irritate the audience since people are creatures of habit. They want to be able to put everything in a box, and once it's there, they don't want it to ever go in another box. But some artists defy categorization, even if it alienates people or puts their hard-won platform at risk. But you know, they got to do what they got to do to continue to grow, challenge, and amuse themselves. And we're going to talk about one of those artists today. So let's bring this back to music. The late 80s, we know, saw a massive sea change with the media mainstream suddenly realizing there was a vast untapped landscape of so-called college radio that was just sitting there ready to be exploited. U2, REM, and Depeche Mode crossed over, and the rest was history, right? Well, then you had the rise of classic industrial and no wave, which inevitably led to industrial rock, because rock can be combined with any genre. It's like the MSG of music. And by 1989, Ministry was the industrial rock band to watch due to their groundbreaking pair of albums, The Land of Rape and Honey and The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, which we covered in episodes 34 and 51, respectively. Not to mention the plethora of Ministry side projects, most of which also successfully rode the alternative wave. We talked about those way back in episode 23. Al Jourgensen and Paul Barker had essentially franchised the Ministry sound across a bunch of projects. They were all delivering sample-laden electronic rock that focused on drums, bass, and aggression. And as you might know, they employed a vast array of collaborators to fill out their various rosters. One of these was a young, shaven-headed Scottish bloke Al happened to meet in a London recording studio in 87 or 88. It was a chance meeting, a lucky one for this fella, because he was there to promote his own band, the Finna Tribe, who it turns out had been recently produced by Paul Barker. Now, Al being Al, he grabbed this guy, stuck him behind a mic, and had him sing on a track. The guy in question was, of course, Chris Connelly. The song would eventually see the light of day as I Will Refuse by Palehead, Al and Paul's project with Ian Mackay, then of Minor Threat and later Fugazi. So Chris's vocal take wouldn't survive on that track, but his partnership with Al would, at least for the next few years. Chris would quickly become Al's vocalist of choice for his main side project, The Revolting Cocks. See, Al had given Chris a platform. Ministry and Revco were far more successful than Finna Tribe ever were. Chris was in the camp on and off through 1992 or so, when he finally parted ways with Al. And from my perspective, Chris definitely became one of the half-dozen figureheads of industrial rock because his name was scattered across the various Ministry-related bands and quickly became synonymous with a certain kind of music and a certain vocal style. Now, with the amount of attention Ministry was getting at the time, I wasn't surprised when word got around that Chris would be making a solo record. Surely, I thought, it would be more of the same, blistering beats with Chris's distinctive shouted vocals, and I saw it was coming out on Wax Trax, naturally enough, which was, of course, the Chicago label that was the center of the industrial rock scene. So the lead-off single came out ahead of the album, and it was presented one night on MTV's 120 Minutes. As you know, I used to religiously record that show on the family VCR. Then I'd get up the next day and fast forward through all the commercials and crap. So to me, 120 minutes was more like 15 minutes by the time I was done, because I was only interested in one or two bands they featured on any given night. But I found Chris's video. It was for a song called Stowaway, and the album would be called Whiplash Boychild, which is a reference, of course, to the Velvet Underground song Venus in Furs, which mentions a whiplash girl child. That should have been my first clue that Chris was going in an unexpected new direction. I watched the video and I was pretty surprised. It had a bit of an electronic beat, but it was far from overdriven. It actually had some piano. And it only featured guitar towards the end. And really, the strangest part was that Chris wasn't just screaming through the whole thing. He was doing something else. I think it was singing. In fact, I would wonder if it were really even him if I hadn't seen him there on the screen, lip-syncing the words while rolling dice and marching around downtown Chicago looking for payphones and slot machines for some reason. Low budget doesn't even begin to describe it. But wow, his vocals sounded entirely different. And the whole vibe of the song was different. And thinking about it, Stowaway was maybe stylistically closest to an older Revolting Cocks song, At the Top, which Chris wrote with Luke Van Acker. It was a B-side to the Stainless Steel Providers single, and I talked about it way, way back in episode 18. It's this odd kind of down-tempo thing that was pretty progressive, especially for the not very progressive Cox. But Stowaway was in that vein with a beat and bass and some piano and some understated vocals, and I figured, okay, it's in the wheelhouse, it makes a bit of sense, but it made me wonder about what would wind up on the album. And speaking of, I'm not actually sure when I bought this thing. I don't think it was right away. To the best of my recollection, I picked this up in a Tower Records in Orlando. Remember Tower Records? Remember that? Wasn't that fun? This was probably in 97 or 98, of course, several years after its release, for sure. But by then, Rec Music Industrial had just picked this thing apart. Folks were drawing comparisons between Chris and the likes of Scott Walker and David Bowie. And indeed, at the time, Chris acknowledged them as two of his heroes. Now, at this point in my life, I had never heard of Scott Walker, so I had no basis for comparison. And my familiarity with Bowie was mostly regarding his most popular stuff, like Let's Dance, which, by the way, featured the then unknown Stevie Ray Vaughan on guitar, and Under Pressure, his duet with Freddie Mercury and Queen, and, of course, Dancing in the Street, his duet with Mick Jagger, and a few of his older classics like Space Oddity. I had a general understanding that he was something like a rock and roll chameleon, being able to reinvent himself every few years and creating characters and whatnot. I also knew that some of my musical heroes, like Ian Curtis, had looked up to him. So these days, I have a better understanding of these comparisons. Chris has excellent vocal chops, a tenor with a good range, something I didn't really expect from his nonstop distorted screaming in Ministry and the Cox. His voice definitely evokes Walker and Bowie, and like them, he was inventive in his musical arrangements. So hearing Whiplash Boychild was a fun ride. It showed sides of Chris that were surprising, to say the least. He was clearly veering into art rock and singer-songwriter territory, charting a path away from industrial, though he would certainly revisit those roots again and again throughout his long career. So the question was, what would the fan reaction be to this album? Now, Chris built up a bit of a platform with his involvement in the popular acts of the day. Would his audience stick with him on this ride? And for sure, there was blowback on RMI. And I even went back and reread some of those posts recently. You can still find them on Google Groups. Nothing ever goes away on the internet, folks. But I wanted to be able to refresh my fading memory of those reactions. And sure enough, there are comments out there like, I'm not saying it sucks, but I was expecting industrial? And is he only going to do lounge act music from now on? And someone even called it, quote, sad candlelight dinner music. But some also said that it proved he was a versatile and talented musician and described him as humble and respectful at his live shows of the time. So the camp was divided. And I've talked a lot on this show about Chris's memoir, Concrete, Bulletproof, Invisible, and Fried, My Life as a Revolting Cock, because it paints the clearest picture yet, I think, of the industrial rock subculture of the late 80s and early 90s from someone who is in the midst of it. Of course, Al has his own memoir, and I've mentioned ad nauseum that it's largely a drug diary, disregarding the music in favor of a lot of celebrity name dropping and showcasing Al's nonstop party guy lifestyle. But in this book, Chris talks about putting together his solo material and then the trepidation he felt about promoting it live, the responsibility of having to put together his own band, make sure everyone got paid, coordinate a tour, and, worrying that no one would even show up. Or maybe worse, that they would show up but just wouldn't get what he was doing, which indeed was the case, at least part of the time. But he did find that he split and shrank his audience. But, to his credit, he didn't shy away. In fact, he would double down and produce 2 more albums in the early 90s, all on Wax Trax, before it went bankrupt. And on them, he developed the sound and approach that he started on Whiplash Boychild. He didn't retreat into some Revco clone, so credit to him for following his own muse, maybe at the expense of his audience. I'll probably get to his other albums later in time, especially his fourth, which he credited to Chris Connelly and the Bells. Personally, it's my favorite so far, but I have a pretty good relationship with all of his 90s albums. Now, back in the Jandek episode, which was number 64, I went into the idea of creative discipline, of producing a body of work through sheer persistence, of just showing up every day, chipping away at it. Now, the classic example is writing a novel, which seems hard to do, right? A decent-sized novel is 60,000 words, more or less. Someone who's focused can write about 2,000 words an hour. So logically, if you spend an hour a day writing, you'll have a novel-length work by the end of a month. It's just a matter of discipline, showing up and doing the work every day. Again, whether it's any good or not is a separate question entirely, one that is entirely subjective. It's going to depend on who you ask, and everyone's going to have their own opinion. That's just the nature of art. But the amount of work is objective. It's quantified. It is not up for debate. 60,000 words is 60,000 words, and no one could argue that you did indeed produce a novel. And I said there's something inspiring about that. To create, you don't have to be good, but it helps to be persistent. And if you can do that, the good part might come in time. Chris Connelly has been persistently producing solo material throughout his whole career, despite his involvement in dozens of bands and projects. He's the frontman of Sons of the Silent Age, a Bowie tribute band. He's married, he has a family life, he wrote his memoir, and from what I hear, he's also managing a record store in Chicago. Yet he has consistently produced solo albums at the rate of about one a year. He has 25 or so of them now, by my count, not including compilations and live albums. I can't say I'm familiar with them all, but I have picked up a few over the years and have always been impressed with his dogged creativity and sheer, consistent output. Now, the Jandek episode really gets into more of that topic, so check it out if you're interested. I don't want to rehash it all now, but I think it's relevant to what Chris has been doing. Chris is still showing up and doing the work year after year. So when and how did this album come about? In his book, he explains that he started it following the recording of the first Pigface album, Gub, which I talked about in episode 58, and the subsequent tour, and work proceeded through the release of Revco's Beers, Steers, and Queers, episode 18, and throughout the Notorious tour to support that album. So he plugged away at it for a while. He pulled in some friends to help. He said that there were, quote, a lot of amazing contributions from Bill Rieflin, who we all know was a brilliant musician, more than just a drummer. And there was guitarist and bassist Stu Zekman, who co-wrote a lot of the tunes and whom would join Stabbing Westward in a few years, with supporting bass from Jessica Valines, who was an engineer at Chicago Track Studios as well as a musician. And then he says that around this time, he became good friends with another guitarist, Chris Bruce, who played, quote, with empathy and intuition and not with his dick. So Chris Bruce isn't credited on this album, so it's not clear if he had any input. The only other credits go to Keith Fluffy Auerbach, another perennial Luxapan sound engineer, and the guys from the fellow Chicago industrial act Die Warsaw, Jim Marcus and Van Christie, for providing a remix of Stowaway as a bonus track. So let's look at this record finally. First, the art and packaging. On the cover, you got a bad Xerox of Chris, which was the style at the time, amidst some purple clouds. Nice. What can I say? This design was the work of Chris and a fella named Tom Young and Brian Shanley, who was more or less Wax Trax's in-house cover designer. On the back, we have a track list. Lists 10 different tracks. The disc actually has 11, though. The unlisted one is a remix of This Edge of Midnight. So we have 9 tracks and 2 remixes. Inside, You got your big Wax Tracks ad, of course, which was standard. The back has pretty much the same info with some extra song credits. And, we've got some lyrics inside and some album credits here as well. Not bad. So the disc, let me get this back together here. The disc is pretty straightforward. Notice that it has the TVT catalog number, so I clearly got a reissue from the days after TVT bought Wax Tracks. The music here is published by Spurburn, which is the publishing company normally associated with Alan Paul's releases. So there you go, a nice little package for a first solo effort. But not much like the Ministry or Revco packaging. For one thing, Al wasn't really in the habit of putting pictures of himself on his record covers. Neither did he like to publish lyrics. So let's do the track by track here. What do we hear when we drop the proverbial needle on Whiplash Boychild? Now, I've listened to this record a lot over the years, but I admit it had been a while since I heard the whole thing end to end. So in preparation for this episode, I sat down and gave it a deep listen to refresh my memory. Let's just walk through the tracks. First up, we have Daredevil. Now, your lead-off track has always got to be a statement of intent. None of this faffing about with moody art pieces. The first track has got to grab the listener by the neck and just not let go. It's got to also be a picture of the rest of the album in microcosm to show the listener what this is all about. So does Daredevil do that? I would say yes. For me, it does. It's got a catchy major key sing-along kind of quality, particularly on the outro. I think it shows off Chris's songwriting chops, his actual singing voice, his tasteful backup vocals, his decidedly non-industrial flares like hand claps and piano. And it's got, of course, Bill's spot-on drumming. I think it's a cool song. It does make me wonder a bit how Chris went about his songwriting. I think it's either Bill or Chris playing the piano on this record, and I know that Chris knew his way around a guitar a bit, so I'm guessing he wrote on those instruments. He never really explained his songwriting process, so I'm not sure, but I think this is a good opener. It sets the mood. It just fades out over a repeating refrain, and by the way, fade-outs. I am not a fan of fade-outs. One thing my bandmate and I did in the 80-plus songs we've written together is we wrote endings to the songs. All of our songs have endings. None of them just fade out. Endings are fun to write. They're cool to write. I think there should be more of them on songs. Of course, we have the Beatles to blame. They introduced the idea of a fade-out, of course, on Hey Jude, where it was meant to imply that the song didn't really stop, but just kept on going and going and going in a way. And in that sense, it was viewed as clever, but I think it's been horribly abused ever since then, and I find fade-outs to be lazy songwriting, and about as cliche as verse, chorus, guitar lead, double chorus. And I'm not picking on Chris Connelly here, but I just want to speak my mind about fade-outs. Not a fan. So that leads us to track 2, Ghost of a Saint, which inexplicably starts with a man speaking words in Spanish. I don't know what he's saying. I don't speak Spanish, other than El hombre con la cabeza anaranjada. So this track is decidedly darker with some minor key piano leading us into the song proper, and Chris is really putting his crooning on display. It might be at this point that I first thought, damn, this guy can really sing. He has a great voice. And I suddenly understood the Bowie comparisons. This song ends as an instrumental with some noisy weirdness and finally fades out. So let's move on to track 3, which finally brings some of the energy that I think Chris's fans might have been clamoring for at this point, because this Edge of Midnight is a rock song, straight up. It's not industrial rock, but it's definitely rock, and it's one of my favorites here. It starts with a guy speaking French this time, and one wonders if it's the same guy. It quickly builds into a verse backed with a staggering Rieflin beat, some bass, and some very Keith Levine-esque trebly guitar. And by the second verse, Bill builds the drums into a pretty awesome gallop, and I'm really digging it. You know, he could really rock the drums. I think this song is cool that it cooks along at a couple different speeds. There's a neat breakdown with the bassist playing over just a crazy delay, which is a bit reminiscent of classic Pink Floyd, like One of These Days or Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. It's a really long song, too. It's just shy of 7 minutes, but it keeps my interest. And most importantly, it doesn't end on a fade out. That goes into track 4, which is The Last of Joy, which is a fantastic little mood piece. It's just a short, reverbed out fantasy of Chris singing over solo piano, presumably played by Bill, with a few strange detuned synth sounds looming in the background. I think it's pretty. I think it's inventive. It's certainly beyond my punk rock understanding of music theory. And if you go in for this sort of tune, you might be pleased to learn that Bill and Chris collaborated on a whole album of music like this. It's called Largo, and they released it in 2000. One of the tracks on Largo is called Salt of Joy, and it's a remake of The Last of Joy, featuring vocals by both of them. So I do encourage you all to check out Largo. I think it is a tremendous and unique work of art, and you could not be more surprised that two former members of the Revolting Cocks could make an album of such subtle magnificence. That's all I can say about it right now. So next up, a tune that I have to admit at the time I had no understanding of at all. It just struck me as being a show tune, something that might be sung on stage, maybe as part of a dramatic performance of some sort, a Broadway musical, off-Broadway musical. It's called The Amorous Humphrey Plug, the very name of which sounded to me like the title of a British Penny Dreadful, or maybe an episode of Doctor Who. Little did I know it was a cover of a Scott Walker song, which appeared on his second solo album, Scott 2, in 1968. And I've gone back and listened to the original, and guess what? Scott Walker's vocals are nearly indistinguishable from Chris Connelly's. Or maybe I should say that Chris's Scott Walker impression is spot on. The original has a kind of schmaltzy backing track that is very orchestral with lots of strings and horns, and Chris dials all that back and just gives some tasteful piano, again, probably played by Bill. I know that Bill would go on to play plenty of keyboards on Chris's later albums. This song does a good job of showcasing Chris's versatility as a singer, as well as his eclectic influences, but what can I say? It doesn't do much for me personally. It just doesn't really ring my bell. So speaking of, let's move on to track 6. The money shot here, Stowaway, which we already talked about a bit. It's got a 4-on-the-floor kick drum, an occasional snare, spooky synths, guitar noise, funky and prominent bass line. This is maybe the most industrial-friendly tune on here. No wonder it was chosen for the single. I did mention the video already. Good stuff. Later, Chris would farm this tune out to Pigface, and a cover of it would appear on their live album, Welcome to Mexico, Asshole. Onward to the mood piece, The Hawk, the Butcher, the Killer of Beauties. And this is another kind of show tune from hell, with Chris largely speaking the lyrics over some very creepy piano. Its arrangement is reminiscent of the intro to the Cocks' No Devotion, since it's mostly just a few repeating figures over a persistent background. But again, we have another fade out, this time with wolves howling. I don't know, fair enough. So finally, we have the other big rock number here, The Game Is All Yours, which is a heavy stomper from the get-go. But again, a straight-up rock song, not industrial at all. Chris is still singing here in his own voice. There's no distortion, no effects, no crazy samples. I like this song a lot. It's a pop song with cool guitar and bass hooks. I think the lyrics and vocal melodies are catchy. And most importantly, it's performed with some energy and dynamics. The verse is fast and loud, and the bridge and chorus are more restrained. It has a really cool breakdown, too, which leaves only Bill's drums for a few bars. Really, I think this song has a Joy Division kind of feel to it. I could easily picture Steve Morris playing this rhythm on Closer, say, and the bass melodies have a definite Peter Hook kind of vibe. And I would hazard to say that Chris could probably pull off a mean Ian Curtis impression if he wanted to. I think his voice has the depth and the power for sure. He would just kind of have to tone down the Scottish accent. Anyway, cool song. I still like it after all these years. Although, another damn fade out. Curses. All right, so now we've made it to the obligatory experimental track. This one is called Confessions of the Highest Bidder, and it's a nearly 11-minute tape loop opus conducted by Chris and Fluffy, and it's mostly boring whispering and mashed up noises, but Chris starts to recite poetry at about 3 minutes in, and at 8 minutes, we have some annoying synth effects, so I guess it's got that going for it, I suppose. I don't know what else to say about this other than artists of a certain genre were expected to do this sort of thing 35 years ago. But nowadays, I just see it as filler. I certainly don't choose to sit and listen to this kind of stuff. It just doesn't float my boat at all. So that leaves the two bonus tracks. We've got Dee Vorzaw's Daydream mix of Stowaway. I do like me some Dee Vorzaw, and we'll have to talk about them one of these days. I think their backing track here is nice and interesting, but I think Chris's vocals for this song just kind of sit on top of them like a slice of Velveeta cheese on an ice cream sundae. I just don't think the two things really go together. I don't know. Take a listen and you tell me. Then on to the hidden track, the so-called sparse mix of This Edge of Midnight. And I don't know what's so sparse about this mix. It has much bigger drums for one thing. It's mixed louder than the original. And in fact, I kind of dig it more. It takes the album out in this really cool delayed bass glissando. At least it wasn't a damn fade out. And there you have it. 11 tracks at just over an hour. If you took out the crazy tape loop track, it'd still be a nice, concise 50 minutes, which I think is a classic album length. So why do I love this? Well, for one, I have a lot of respect for Chris as a musician and as an artist, and as one of the few folks from the classic Chicago industrial scene who's bothered to share his story with the world. Maybe someday Paul Barker will decide to speak up, and I'm sad that Bill never did. I think that would have been fascinating. But then Bill always seemed to me like the kind of guy who was looking forward. Later in life, he was firmly into whatever he was doing with REM at the time, and then with what he was doing with Robert Fripp and friends, and kind of got the impression he didn't spend much time pining for the old days of hanging out at the Smart Bar and trying to keep Al away from heroin. Anyway, this disc was my first indication that Chris had a life beyond Al, and that he had some kind of musical vision other than just singing So What for the next 40 years. And hell, it was proof that he was willing to take a chance, right? He took what artistic capital he had amassed from the Luxapan circle and invested it in himself, trusting that the true fans would stick with him through that transition. And you know what? We did. So today I probably own a half dozen or more of Chris's albums, and the guy has a very deep catalog that I know I could spend a lot of time exploring. Chris didn't seem to think it was so calculated, though. To him, it wasn't really a transition. It was just the kind of music he wanted to make. And he said, Whiplash Boychild was, and I quote, as far away from the sound of Ministry or the Cox as you would care to imagine. But why would I wish to make a record that sounded like Ministry or the Cox, but not as good if I was currently involved in the real deal? This is all part of the quandary that has dogged me ever since. I had no interest in doing what many people from bands do in making solo albums, i.e., sound exactly like the bands they are from. And there you have it. So Whiplash Boychild is maybe the first non-industrial Wax Trax album I ever bought. In some ways, it presented a vision of post-industrial music, at least viewed by one guy who dared to do something different. And of course, Chris had his ups and downs in those early days, and his memoir doesn't hide the downs, the drugs, the depression, the poor health and poor choices. And he's quick to skewer himself, though, as he is to skewer Al or anyone else, maybe more so. And I think for sure he's matured a lot in the intervening years. And thank goodness, because he probably wouldn't still be with us otherwise. These days, I find Chris to be likable and relatable. He's a guy I'd like to sit and have coffee with. I'm not sure I could say the same about Al. What with Al's superstitions, his name dropping, and just his glowing pride over his unabated substance abuse. Al's clearly an intelligent, funny guy, but, in some ways, he just never grew up. And granted, that's why we love him. This album, though, is the first spark of what would become the bulk of Chris's career, a career that's impressive in its breadth and depth and consistency over the last 35 years, and that's why I love it. So what happened next? Well, you might know that Chris wavered in and out of the Ministry camp, depending on Al's whims, and Chris wrote some stuff for Psalm 69, but was not asked to join them in headlining Lollapalooza in '92. Instead, he toured with Pigface and fronted a one-off collaboration with Killing Joke, who had temporarily misplaced their singer, Jazz Coleman, and that project was called Murder, Inc. And you already know that Chris wrote a big chunk of the third Revolting Cocks album, Linger Fickin' Good, to which I devoted episode 74. Shortly after that, Al would devolve into serious heroin use, and Chris wouldn't work with him again until an unexpected onstage reunion just a few years ago, where they both performed So What? Arm in Arm. This after pretty squarely slagging each other off in their respective memoirs. Well, time heals all wounds, I guess. And I'd like to imagine there was something sincere in that reunion, that it wasn't just a publicity stunt to prop up a Ministry tour. I will happily remain ignorant on that subject. And by the way, I'm still waiting for that final Ministry album. The final one, for reals this time, because I understand it'll once again be a Luxapan joint with Paul Barker back on board after 20 years. I give you my word now that I will absolutely devote an episode to that album if it ever happens, despite having never listened to anything at all on a Ministry album after Animositis Omina. Well, there you have it, folks. Chris Connelly's first jaunt into his solo career, Whiplash Boychild, a daring romp indeed, and one that still sounds fresh and interesting decades later. Maybe because he had the good sense to not use a bunch of now cliched Fairlight samples, instead of relying on, gosh, I don't know, actual musical talent? The mind boggles indeed. Chris, if you're listening by chance, cheers. I doubt you remember, but I designed a logo for one of your projects once, and we had a brief chat about it. You were a real gentleman. Kids, I can say that it's okay to meet your heroes if they're as well-spoken and polite as Mr. Connelly. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or on the podcast platform of your choice. The show that hereby promises to never ever deviate from what the people want. We'll just keep giving it to you over and over without a thought to broadening our horizons or pushing the limits. After all, the consumer is king and unhappiness is treason. Far be it from us to challenge you in any way, so from now on, we'll only be posting content having to do with Trent Reznor's wardrobe, and that's it. Well, possibly hairstyles, because, his beard while inducting The Cure into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was rakish, you gotta admit. Okay, yes, wardrobe and hairstyles, but that's it. From now on, nothing but Trent, 24/7, 365, because that's what you all want, right? As always, thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.